Welcome to Chicks Who Fly, a podcast dedicated to women pilots and women in aviation. My name is Anaya, and I am your host. I am a vocalist, a DJ, and a producer, and I'm also a student pilot. I am currently working on my private pilot certificate, and while I am getting some finances in place to finish my training, I have decided to stay active in the aviation community by starting this podcast, among other things. I plan to interview and feature different women pilots and women in aviation and bring those interviews to you. And hopefully you guys enjoy the interviews as much as I enjoy spending time with these amazing ladies. In today's episode, I get to have a conversation with Cheryl Pitzer. Cheryl has been a captain for FedEx for 24 years. In today's episode, she shares about her training, all her different ratings, including helicopter and seaplane. And we also talk about some of the more unusual cargo she has flown, which includes whales and dolphins. We also talk about her volunteer work for Orbis Flying Eye Hospital, which is something truly special and wonderful. Another thing we get to discuss in today's episode are some of the different jobs in aviation that Cheryl has had, including being a flight attendant for Continental and being an aircraft dispatcher, a CFII, and a DPE. If you are enjoying this podcast, please consider following us on Spotify and subscribing on YouTube. It really helps us get the podcast out to more and more people. If you'd really like to be a more intimate part of the whole process of creating this podcast, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon, where our page is called Chicks Who Fly. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do that at chickswhoflyofficial@gmail.com. And please also feel free to visit our website and connect with us there at chickswhofly.com. And now, without further ado, here is the conversation that I got to have with Cheryl Pitzer. Hi, Cheryl. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and spending time to talk shop with me, which is my favorite thing to do. Welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Awesome. I guess we want to go ahead and start with the basics. What are your ratings? What's your relationship to aviation at the moment, and where are you based?
Well, I am ATP rated. I also keep my CFI current. In fact, I just actually got my helicopter rating, which was really fun to do. And I work for FedEx. I'm a captain. I've been at FedEx for 24 years. I'm an instructor and a line check airman there also. Yeah, I'm based in Memphis. I live in Dallas, but I'm actually based in Memphis with FedEx.
Wonderful. So you commute to Memphis?
Normally, yes. Also, we do a lot of what's called deadheading, where the FedEx will buy us tickets, like I usually fly on American, and I will go to where my trip starts. For instance, my next trip starts in Bahrain, and so I'll be flying on American Airlines and Gulf Air to get over to Bahrain, and I'll start my FedEx trip there.
Oh, wonderful. So you do a lot of international flying with FedEx?
Yeah, a mix, which I like. I do both international and domestic. We are not divided like a lot of airlines divide their pilots and you do one or the other, but at FedEx, we can do virtually whatever we want, which is nice. I can do a short one-day trip, or I could do a 12-day international trip.
That sounds like you don't have the chance to get bored or get stuck in a routine.
Correct, which I like. Some people prefer to do the same thing over and over again. A lot of us commute, like I do, so a lot of our pilots will fly to their home city and be home every night, and they like that. Particularly people that have small children, that works out really well for them.
That makes perfect sense. So
How did you realize that you were interested in aviation, and how did that journey begin for you?
Well, my degree is in marketing and advertising, and I realized during college I could sell easily spring break trips. And so I got to go for free. I took all my friends on spring break trips for free, and I thought this was great. So when I graduated, I wanted to work for an airline or cruise line or somebody I could take a lot of free vacations with. And Continental was hiring flight attendants at the time. And so I applied and got hired there. And my original plan was to just fly for a couple of years and get my foot in the door and then work my way into the marketing department. And it just turned out that I was constantly in the cockpit saying, what's that? What's that? How's that work? I found out you don't have to necessarily go in the military to get your ratings. So I decided I wanted to be a pilot and just went to a local airport and started taking lessons.
In a Part 61 school?
Correct, yeah. I did all my training Part 61, yeah.
Wonderful. What was the process like of starting your training and going down the line of all the ratings?
I was fortunate. I had most of my experience was good. I did almost all my ratings at the same school and just kind of worked my way through private instrument, commercial, CFII. Then I started teaching. I got a job flying traffic watch, ultimately worked my way into a charter as a contract pilot, and finally along the way I actually got my aircraft dispatcher license also, and I was fortunate. I ended up being a flight attendant for 4 years while I was building my time, and then I got hired as a dispatcher at Continental. I did that for 2 years, and I was flying on the side all that time, and ultimately I got my first full-time flying job for a company called Merlin Express, which was actually the Metroliner factory out of San Antonio. Flew them for a couple years, and then ultimately got hired at FedEx.
Wow, that sounds like a really cool path to take. Did you have anyone who kind of felt like a mentor to you or gave you particularly good advice or support along the way?
My parents, fortunately, were extremely supportive. But outside that, it was more of just a combination of the people I ran across. Staying at Continental all that time was quite helpful because it gave me focus, it gave me direction, and I would just reach out to different people that I respected and ask their advice about things. And, there was times it was rough. There was a lot of times that I was discriminated against being female, but I just tried to ignore it and press on, and ultimately things did work out. So it was great.
Awesome. Let me ask you about, I'm particularly interested in any highlights of your training, like really great moments, and also some of the more difficult challenges for you throughout your training process.
I think probably the rating I was most proud of was the ATP. Nothing really stands out. There were ups and downs through all of them. My private license, I managed to get through it took me about 6 months, but it was overall pretty positive. And of course, getting the rating was wonderful. But there were times that, I had a bad day in the airplane and I felt like, gosh, am I ever going to get this? And other days, it's like it just kind of was like butter, and it all went really well. And I go, okay, what did I do that made it so easy? And I didn't necessarily know the answer, but all my ratings were that way. Just a bit of some ups and some downs, but nothing I look back on like, gosh, I hated that or anything like that.
You never had a time during your training that you kind of scared yourself?
There was one time I was getting ready to get my multi-engine instructor rating. And I remember I was really broke and I needed to have a root canal. And I was a little bit stressed out about how I was going to pay for that. And I was thinking about it in the airplane. And that's one thing I have learned over the years is you have to put other things out of your mind, other things going on in your life out of your mind while you're in the cockpit. And I do remember the guy that was instructing me, instead of talking about what we were going to do, he just pulled back an engine and it surprised me and I froze for a minute. And he looked at me and he goes, well, aren't you going to recover? And I was like, oh yeah. And then after he had to prompt me, he's like, what's up with you? You don't seem like yourself. And I started telling him about this root canal. And he kind of was like, wake up, worry about that later. We'll figure something out if you need help, and we'll talk about it on the ground when get busy. And I was like, oh, yeah, you're right. And that was a lesson learned for me. When I find myself with my mind drifting, even today at work, I have to bring myself back to the cockpit, and the other things are on the ground.
That definitely, while you're in the air, is not the time to start worrying and wondering about other things.
Right, because you can't do anything about it right then anyway. So.
Very good point. And I hear a lot of people say, I think myself included, that one of their favorite things is how you have to be completely focused on what you're doing. A lot of people compare it to a very meditative experience. Do you find that? I mean, you're flying cargo. What is that like? From the cockpit door back, I don't typically think about it a lot. When I'm flying at FedEx, it's cargo, but we fly a lot of animals, a lot of zoo animals, lots and lots of horses. And those, when we have animals on board, they'll have handlers on board. We also, I'll commute back and forth on FedEx. A lot of our pilots do. So there are quite often more people on the airplane. And so if they're back there, I'll try to think about them. But I don't think so much about the cargo unless it's alive. But I also volunteer for an organization called Orbis International, which is a fantastic organization. And it's a flying eye hospital, and quite often we'll have the hospital staff back there. But I guess to answer your question it's the same for me every day. I don't really think I have to be safer today than I am a different day or do something a different way. The only consideration I give to that is if we have pressure sensitive animals. Flew some whales not too long ago. They're very pressure sensitive, so I might change procedures, slow climb out, gradual descent for them. But other than that, it's pretty much all the same. Wow,
Does that answer your question?
Whales. Yeah, that's just so cool. How do you get a whale in an airplane?
Very carefully. It's quite interesting, actually. I've flown quite a few whales and dolphins. They teach them to swim into a sling, like a stretcher, and then they lift that sling and set it into what is basically a giant bathtub. And so the animal is just hanging out in the sling, and they have plenty of water, and they have their handlers will put wet towels on their backs. They'll scoop water onto them. They feed them. And the animals have been conditioned to do all this, so it's really not a big deal for them. The hardest thing for us is on takeoff and landing, not letting any of the water slosh out of the bathtub.
This presents some very unique challenges. I love hearing about it too, though, because one of my really big dreams and things that I hope to be able to do once I get at least my primary certificate to even begin with is I'd love to volunteer for rescue organizations and fly animals, cats and dogs, and maybe hopefully one day even whales and dolphins and giraffes and camels. That's amazing.
Right. Yeah, there's a wonderful organization actually that's called Pilots and Paws. If you're not familiar with it, it's they move dogs around the country from shelters to maybe a shelter that they would not have a very good chance of being adopted from, to some place that they either already are adopted or will have a really good chance of being adopted. And it's just private individuals in their own airplanes volunteer their time to fly these animals about, and it's a really fantastic organization.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. The owner of the school I first started learning to fly in used to fly for a rescue organization that is local and that focuses on cats mostly. And it's actually the organization that helped me get two of the cats that I currently have and live with. We have a total of 3. So
wonderful. I love hearing stories like that.
And we actually have one of our cats is a little tripod. We found him in our parking lot. He had all 4 legs at the time, and he had apparently been hit by a car, and he was really skinny and had no fur, and he was dying under the cars in the parking lot, trying to live there, but not, he wasn't going to make it much longer. And I called a friend of mine who works for that organization. It's called Stray Cat Alliance. And they helped me get him into a veterinary office, and I was going to find him a good home. And we ended up getting really attached. We raised enough money to have, first we tried to save the leg. Tried very hard. A lot of people did and donated time and money and work, and it didn't work, and we ended up having to amputate the leg. But now he looks like a fat, furry croissant, and he's the happiest cat ever.
Oh, he's a lucky guy.
Yeah, love that guy. Going back to your training, I wanted to ask, which rating of all the ones that you have was the most challenging to get?
Most challenging was probably my CFI. I think probably most people would give you that same answer. It's a very challenging check ride. It was about 8 hours long. So I mentioned earlier, I keep my CFI current because I don't want to have to go through that again.
I don't blame
use
you.
it occasionally. Yeah, I don't teach much. I do an occasional tail wheel endorsement for somebody, but that was probably the most challenging. And then, at work, type ratings are challenging also, and I probably a little more so because my career is on the line with those, so they can be more stressful, I guess.
Right. And which was the most fun? I mean, I also understand, sorry, I'm going to interrupt my own question. Just because a couple of days ago, I interviewed the first helicopter pilot that I've interviewed for the podcast, and I always understood that helicopters are naturally very unstable machines and they're much more difficult to fly. How did you end up getting a helicopter rating?
It's something I'd always wanted to do, but couldn't. It's very expensive compared to airplanes, and just never really could justify the cost. But my husband and I got back into general aviation a few years ago. I realized we went to Oshkosh, I don't know, probably 6-7 years ago, and we were talking. My husband also flies for FedEx and has a civilian background. And we were talking, and I was saying, I think I could count on one hand the amount of times that I had flown for fun. It had always been towards a rating, towards my career. I never really had flown for fun. And he said, neither have I. And so we decided to buy an airplane. And it's kind of like your rescue cats. You start with one, and then you end up with three. So we had a couple airplanes, and we'd always want to get our helicopter rating. And our friend and mechanic had a helicopter that he wanted to sell. This little Schweitzer 300, little two-seat training helicopter. So he said, hey, there was about 4 of us that wanted to get our ratings. And he's like, okay, you guys can get your ratings. Just pay me my cost, and then I'm going to sell it when you're done. So I was all excited. I lined up an instructor, had the insurance lined up, and it turned out he found a crack in one of the rotor blades. And unfortunately, with these training helicopters, there are no parts, and the parts that are out there are extremely expensive. So these helicopters are now worth 4 times the value in parts than they are put together. So he couldn't justify repairing the rotor blade when he could part out the helicopter for a lot more money. So that's what he ended up doing, and we were all disappointed. Well, it turns out not long after that, the same year model helicopter came on the market from a friend of a friend kind of a thing. And helicopters are different from airplanes when the components are all time limited. And when the time is up, you must replace them. There's no doing an inspection and continuing on like an airplane. You have to replace them. And again, because the parts are so scarce, it just becomes a problem. Well, it turns out this helicopter that was for sale was 1 year model off from my friend who was parting his out. There were several components coming due on the one for sale, which my friend had on his that he was parting out. And just the stars just kind of aligned. And next thing I knew, we had a helicopter. And neither my husband and I had our ratings, so we learned. And so, yeah, I think I got my rating about a year ago. And it is very, very fun. I
want to be you when I grow up.
We just kind of fell into it. It was, but you started the question about the funnest rating. I think the funnest rating, because the helicopter was challenging, the funnest rating I ever did was my seaplane rating. And that was I had a ball doing that.
That was the next thing I was going to ask you about because I'm dying to get a seaplane rating. I see these videos of people flying in the Maldives, like between islands, and they're flying in shorts with their hair down and like sandals, and I'm from Puerto Rico, so I'm like, yeah, I want to do that. So please tell me about the seaplane rating.
I highly recommend it. I kind of did it on a fluke. I ended up with a 5-day layover in Honolulu for FedEx, and it was over 4th of July weekend a few years ago, and I'm like, what am I going to do for 5 days in Honolulu? It'll be fun, and there's a seaplane base right at the airport. In fact, it's right next to the FedEx ramp at Honolulu International. So I went over there and I was flying with them, but the only examiner in the islands was away for the holiday weekend, so I couldn't actually take my rating ride. And it turned out that I had a long Anchorage layover a couple weeks after that, and so I went up there and flew in a little Super Cub and kind of brushed up on that and took my check ride while I was up there, and it was just super fun, part in Hawaii, part in Alaska. Just kind of worked out that way, and just super fun.
So you got both extremes, Hawaii to Alaska. That's kind of awesome.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. So, and I will say, I went to college in Hawaii for a while, and I love it there. But I have to say that the flying in Alaska was far more amazing. The island of Oahu is still controlled, and you have to talk to controllers, and it's busy airspace. But we got up to Anchorage, and I'm like, you're just flying from pond to pond, and there's moose, and there's bear, and there's everybody else is kind of doing the same thing, and it was really a lot more grassroots float plane flying, and I really had a ball.
It seems like every time I do one of these interviews, I end up adding at least one thing to my bucket list, and I think I'm up to 3 now with you.
Well, good. I hope I'm inspiring more people to go out and have fun flying, not get stuck like I did for 30 years without doing any fun flying.
Yeah, definitely. I think that flying for the fun of it is the purest motivation. I mean, the stuff you're describing sounds unreal, amazing. I think another one would be for me to see an aurora borealis from an airplane. I mean, to see it at all, but to see it from an airplane sounds like something really incredible. What time of year were you in Alaska? Did you get to see an aurora borealis at all?
I've seen them in the past, yes. When I did my rating was in the summertime. But I've been up there. Actually, I had a friend who was on the Iditarod Air Force. He lives up in Anchorage, and that's the people will shuttle dogs and dog food and vets to the different points on the Iditarod race from Anchorage to Nome. And so I went along with him one time. He had a plane on skis, and that was really fun. And I actually saw some really fantastic light shows, if you will, on that trip, in particular up near Nome. Yeah, that was a really fun trip too.
Nice. Yeah, who needs fireworks when you could just see an aurora borealis?
Yes, yeah.
You mentioned earlier about you and your husband having a couple of airplanes. What airplanes do you have?
We have a Pitts and a Husky also.
Do you get to fly them much?
Not as much as I'd like to, but yeah, we have some acreage here in Dallas. I have horses and some other animals, and then we have a little grass strip I fly the Husky out of. It's just got the big Tundra tires on it, and that's a lot of fun. It's fun, to kind of go low and slow. I think that's one of the things I like about the helicopter. After, high and fast for work, and then I can go low and slow for fun.
Awesome. Let me ask you this. Now that you're flying for fun, you're flying for a living, you've been with this company for 24 years, you started as a flight attendant, like you've gotten to do all these amazing things. what's next?
I have no idea. I guess retirement. It's got a few years left for that, but I don't know. You never know what the future holds.
You're just open.
Yeah. Well, I have 2 grandbabies now, so I think that will probably take up quite a bit of time, which I'm excited about.
How old are your grandkids?
I have one's 2 and the other one's coming 1. They're still little.
And yeah, that's tiny, and you want to get to spend some time with them, I'm sure.
Yeah.
How many kids do you have, and do they fly?
I have 3 stepchildren. They're my husband's children. They're all grown, and no, none of them really have expressed any interest in flying. One of them took a couple lessons, thought he might be interested, but when he kind of realized there's quite a bit of work involved, I think he kind of lost interest. So they like to go for rides, but not. Flying's funny. It's you either have a passion for it, or you really could just care less. There doesn't really seem to be an in between.
Yeah, I've noticed that when the subject of flying comes up with people, they completely light up and they're super excited, or they have like a lot of fear of it and not comfortable with it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
And even I was really impressed that one of the pilots and CFIs that I interviewed on the podcast actually had a very real and intense fear of flying, and then ended up becoming a pilot and a CFI, which I find particularly exactly turning that around. We've got to find a way to bottle that, right?
Wow, yeah. It takes so much time and money and effort to get your ratings for somebody that has a fear of it to really want to do that. That's amazing.
I agree. When you were doing your training, how did you pay for it? Did you take out loans, or did you have money saved up, or help? How did that work out for you?
I begged, borrowed, and stole everything I could. I was fortunate. My parents did help me some. I had some scholarship winnings. I was working full time as a flight attendant for most of it, and then a dispatcher. And I literally hung out at the airport, and I was fortunate. I built a lot of time, particularly multi-time, by just being available. There were, a lot of people. You'll find a lot of people around airports. Business owners that fly themselves on trips. There was a guy that had a Baron that he sold pacemakers, and he would fly around Texas to different hospitals to do surgeries, and he liked to have basically a safety pilot or somebody go with him. And so he would just call and say, "Hey, I'm going right now. Do you want to come?" And I would drop everything I was doing, and I would go with him, and he let me fly the airplane along the time. And I just kind of became known as reliable and available and willing to drop everything to go, basically be a safety pilot. And once you do it once, then the phone calls start coming, and that's how I built a lot of my time, actually.
Well, that's really good to know. That's actually how I took my unofficial discovery flight. I used to live 5 minutes from the Santa Monica airport, and the owner of the school that I first started learning at had changed out the magnetos on one of his Cirrus aircraft, and he invited me to come along for the ride. And we flew to Santa Barbara and had lunch and then flew back. And I mean, after that, you couldn't get me out of an airplane at every chance I get. And actually, I find that as a DJ, things worked out that way for me too. I got a call at a really great venue when somebody couldn't make it, and I started being known as reliable. And once you do it once, the phone kept ringing. So it's great to know that it works that way in aviation, because now I'm here as that meme that says, "Be brave enough to suck at something new." Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. And it's, there are so many opportunities and so many nice people out there with some really nice airplanes that you would never normally get to fly. So it's just kind of all about the contacts.
True. That's how I got to fly a Mooney, but now I'm in a new place and I have to build new relationships. We moved to Palm Springs.
Oh, okay. Nice.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, cool aviation stuff going on here. There's, Palm Springs International, but then there's also Bermuda Dunes and a couple cool little airports around. So I need to start showing my face around there some more.
Right. Yeah, and join, some of the local flying clubs or, the safety, the FAA safety seminars. And, that's a way to meet a lot of people too.
That's actually very good advice, which brings me to the next question, which is, what kind of advice do you have for aspiring pilots and student pilots?
Just to follow your passion, and there you're going to have good days and bad days, just like you would doing anything else. And just to stick with it, hang in there, surround yourself with positive people and people that you respect. I learned a ton from a lot of these pilots that I met that a lot of them own airplanes. So I learned a lot from them about how to take care of an airplane. I learned about acting like a professional, even if I wasn't. Even before I was a commercial pilot, I acted like I was. I told the truth. I was reliable. And I ignored all the outside chatter and the naysayers and, just to follow your dream. If that's what you want to do, then don't let anybody stop you from it.
That's excellent advice. Do you have a favorite flight that you can remember doing either for fun or for work?
You and I had talked earlier about my animals, and I really enjoy doing the animal charters and having the animals on board, and that just kind of holds just a special spot for me. And it's challenging to deal with special cases like the whales, but I think I'm probably more excited about Orbis International. For instance, I just took, it's a volunteer. There's about 17 of us that volunteer for this organization. It's a MD-10 aircraft. It was former DC-10, turned into an MD-10, turned into a hospital, and we take it mostly to developing nations. We just went to Ghana with it, and the airplane will stay for several weeks, and it's a teaching hospital, fully U.S. accredited teaching hospital. And the volunteer surgeons will come and teach local doctors techniques that we in the U.S. take for granted, glaucoma, cataracts, certain things with retinas, and literally they take people who cannot see, and within hours these people can see and they can work and they can go to school. It's really, really an amazing organization. So when I get to fly that airplane, anytime I get to fly that airplane is super special.
Yeah, I mean, it's mind-blowing the difference that we can make in other people's lives with something that we take for granted over here.
Right. And it's funny, that you feel like, I used to feel like I don't know what skills I have to offer, to give back to the community. I can fly, but there's not always so much you can do with that. But there's starting to get to be so much more. Like we talked about Pilots and Paws. There's an organization called Angel Flight that flies people to treatments that can't afford to fly. There are, you talk about the cats. There's Orbis. There's getting to be so much more that you can use your pilot skills to give back with, and I think that's really exciting.
That is really exciting. I think it's one of the most important things, how whatever you have to really make a difference in other people's lives. And I think that sometimes it's easy to not understand how aviation can help you do that. And these are all like really great examples and really inspiring.
Yeah, it's just feels good. Feels good to do some good.
Do you have any moments that you remember when you've been teaching students that were particularly hairy? trying to keep a student from killing you?
Yeah. You know, I had a couple men that were large and strong, and there was one in particular that I was always I always felt like he was probably going to freeze on the controls, and I had decided one day I was flying with him that if he did freeze on the controls, that I was going to backhand him in the nose. You know, hopefully that would surprise him enough to let go. And after that flight, I realized that it would be best for all of us if I passed him to a different instructor. So I gave him to another male who was kind of a larger guy, and I just felt like that was better for everybody. I had probably the worst was, I used to be an examiner actually, and I was giving a check ride to a young girl who did come close to crashing. Strangely, she was doing really well on the check ride, but then she just kind of, I don't know what she did, and I had to scream at her to let go of the controls. I almost thought I was going to have to hit her in the nose. Like, she did let go, but we scraped a wingtip, and that was pretty scary. And the strangest thing about that was not so much that it happened, but she couldn't understand why she didn't pass her check ride.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, and then her dad called me, and he didn't want to pay the deductible on the airplane, and it turned into this giant mess. And actually, it was it was about the time I stopped being an examiner. I realized it wasn't worth the things I had to go through. So, yeah.
Yeah. I don't blame you.
I haven't thought about these things in a long time.
Yeah, no, I understand. I'm asking you to go back a few years in the Rolodex for sure.
Yeah, a lot of years.
Yeah, I mean, you've been in the same company for a long time, and then you kind of forget all the process and all the stuff that becomes a distant memory.
Well, the memories are, I would say, 99.9% good memories. So.
Well, that's a good thing, definitely, especially if you're spending your life doing this. What kind of dynamic is there with the schedule between you and your husband? Like, what's your home like with two pilots?
You know, the good thing is, and particularly working for the same company, is we understand each other's schedules. And you know, quite often not home on the holidays or birthdays, or, you know, trips get extended unexpectedly, or, you know, I understand that you know, just because my husband's in Paris for 48-hour layover, it's not a paid vacation. You know, you still have to study for your flights. You have to sleep appropriately. And I think sometimes when you aren't in the same business, you might think, oh, well, you're just out there having this great time partying or doing things you shouldn't be doing. Or I think that can cause stress in a lot of marriages. But we understand each other's schedules, and we fly the same airplane. My husband's also a checked airman, so we bounce ideas off of each other about, hey, I had this happen. Have you ever had that happen to you? Hey, there's a new procedure. Do you understand it? So we get to share a lot of that. As far as our schedule, though, it's kind of hit and miss. I mean, some months we're home together a lot, and some months we are not. It's just, I don't know. Neither one of us know any easier. We spent our entire professional lives working for airlines, and it's just normal to us.
Yeah, I get the feeling that it's challenging, but it might also help keep things fresh because you miss each other and then appreciate the time you get together a little more, no?
Very true. Yes, very true. I had broken my hand a few years ago, and I was home for quite a while. And finally my husband was like, don't you need to go back to work? I've been home by myself in weeks.
How did you break your hand?
Well, I've broken them each, actually. But that one, I fell off my horse.
Oh.
You know, yeah. It happens.
Yeah, I understand. I don't spend a lot of time around large animals because I guess I never lived that long in a place that had enough space for them. So, but yeah, a horse is an understandable way to break your hand. My mom had her femur broken when our pet Great Dane wanted to play with her and jumped on her. So.
Oh no. Yeah, I mean, it was just kind of a stupid fall that I had. I wasn't paying attention, and it just always seems like you're doing nothing and that times you get hurt.
Oh yeah, totally. I was a professional dancer. That was my first career, and I used to leap and spin and turn and do all sorts of stuff and be fine. But walking was how I would sprain my ankle and end up on crutches for a month. So,
right.
So I understand. You have 2 camels, which is freaking amazing. But the picture also has a horse. So I'm assuming, tell me a little bit about your pet family.
Well, we have the 2 camels. Like you said, I have 2 females. They're 9 years old. I've got 2 horses and 7 donkeys. And we have a Z-donk. He's half zebra, half donkey. He's a bit of a trip. And let's see, we have 3 dogs. Got 3 Australian Shepherds and 3 barn cats.
Holy poo, that sounds, yes, I most definitely want to be you when I grow up. That sounds amazing.
It's just like they multiply, like you said, your cats. You start with one and the next thing you know, you have a whole bunch.
Yeah, this city living and apartment living that I so love is ceasing to work for me because my husband and I love animals and all sorts of animals, and we want to have more. So we're actually in the process of trying to buy some land in Joshua Tree and build a container home. And one of our main motivations is we want to be able to have animals. So I relate to that. And I know that's not aviation, but I had to ask.
Well, it's funny. We always lived in a normal subdivision, and so we bought this place. And I was a little worried with us both being gone so much. So that does present challenges for taking care of the animals. But, where there's a will, there's a way. And I think that's great that you get some land and you can build yourself a little runway, too.
Oh, that's, you read my mind. So in Joshua Tree, in the area that I'm looking at, there's an old airport that has been abandoned, and basically now all that's left of it is you can see a dirt strip where the runway used to be. And if I could find a way to buy that airport and revitalize that area, have, general aviation people flying in, have people flying. I've actually spoken with one of my fellow Los Angeles 99s. She works with an organization that flies dogs that they rescue from China, from that horrible festival that they have where they torture dogs. And she works with an organization that rescues them and flies them to the U.S. I'll have her on sometime. She's amazing. She also has 3 dogs that she rescued from India. And, we're both very excited about just the idea. I don't know how realistic or doable it is, but if I could find a way to buy this airport with some people and help the community and help some animals and maybe put a cool restaurant in there and stuff like that, I would be living my dream. I could die complete.
Oh, I hope you do, and I will come fly in. That would be wonderful.
Oh my God, that would be absolutely amazing. Cheryl, what is the most challenging thing that you find about being a pilot professionally?
I think probably staying, this is going to sound funny, staying proficient, and I mean that in a way of not getting complacent. I've been, I fly the MD-11 for FedEx. I've been flying it for 18 years, and so staying fresh could sometimes be a challenge. When I go to training, I think, I've done this 100 times, but there's always some new procedure. There's always some new piece of equipment. There's always new techniques that are out and about. So really focusing on that and not getting complacent is probably the biggest challenge.
Oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. And going back to, sorry, I'm jumping around a lot. I'm just so excited with all the stuff that you're sharing. But you said, you talked about the challenge of both of you having pets and animals and being away a lot. How do you manage?
We're very fortunate. We board one horse, and that horse belongs to our vet. And so when we're both out of town, she comes and takes care of everybody for us. So it's a really, really nice relationship. You know, the hard part is finding somebody who is reliable, and she's very reliable, obviously, and has the self-interest of you know, doing right by her horse too. So I can't. I love her to death, and it's just been very fortunate to find her.
Yeah, that sounds like it works out perfectly. So I think we've covered so much. I mean, this has been really awesome. Is there anything that you want to leave the listeners with before we say goodbye?
Just like I said before, you know, hang in there. I think most of your listeners are probably up-and-coming pilots, and just hang in there and follow your passion. And just because, you know, somebody else says, oh, you should be an airline pilot, if that's not your passion, you know, go the way that it is. There's so many, you know, ways to go in aviation, not just pilots, but maintenance and airport owners. and just, you know, if you love it, stick with it and accomplish your dreams.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And you know what? I know I said that was what I was going to leave everyone with, but you just reminded me. I wanted to ask you a little bit about being a dispatcher. What was that like?
I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. I was amazed by the dispatchers who were not pilots, the level of knowledge that they had. I quite frankly, I couldn't figure out how I would have done the job had I not. I was a commercial pilot at the time, and not, you know, knowing how to read jet plates and knowing a lot of the regulations. I would think that would be a hard thing to transition into. So it was an amazing group of people, and I really liked it.
And what did the job entail? What does a dispatcher do?
So the dispatchers, most airlines are set up the same way. You'll have a global operations control is what we call it at FedEx. I think we called it system control at Continental. And so the dispatchers will start several hours before a flight. They'll look at the weather, the NOTAMs, the flight planning, the routing, any kind of, you know, TFRs, internationally, anything going on internationally. You can imagine some of these flights, you know, it's not like reading the weather NOTAMs from Santa Monica to Palm Springs. It can get quite complicated. There's countries you can't fly over. There's countries you need overflight permits for. So the dispatcher does all of that. It's basically all of the flight planning. They order the fuel, all the planning for, you know, the pilots. They know the payload, all that. And so when the pilots show up at a 121, at 135 also carrier, that's all done for us. So when I get there, I review the paperwork, and I'll either agree with the dispatcher, we may tweak the fuel, but basically that all the planning part is already done. And the dispatcher, it is a license, an FAA license. You take a check ride for it, just like a pilot's license. Obviously not in the air, but and the dispatcher is legally jointly responsible for the flight with the captain. And then once the flight starts, the dispatcher does the flight following. We are always in contact with them if there's some changes or the weather changes or a situation changes. The dispatcher is always in contact with the pilots and making a joint decision about how to handle, say, there's an emergency or airport closure for some reason. That's a joint responsibility between the dispatcher and the captain. It's a great job.
Oh, really interesting. And it must have helped prepare you for the flying that's to follow in your career.
It did, because I would get calls as a dispatcher. I would get calls from captains, you know, with a question that I'd never thought of, or a lot of times didn't know the answer for either. And so that would be my job, is to coordinate everything. As a dispatcher, it was my job to coordinate everything for that crew. And so, yeah, I learned a ton doing that.
That's absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing all this wealth of knowledge and advice and experiences. It's been really inspiring and fun to talk to you. So thank you so much for making time to talk to me and to come on the podcast. I really appreciate it, and I wish you just the best of luck in everything that's to follow for you.
Oh, thank you. It was fun for me too, and I wish you luck with all of your endeavors too.
And that concludes today's episode of Chicks Who Fly with Cheryl Pitzer. Thank you so much for joining us and for being a part of this entire journey. If you are enjoying this podcast, please consider following us on Spotify and subscribing on YouTube, as well as sharing with all your friends who might enjoy this podcast as well. Also, if you would like to be more intimately involved with the creation of this podcast, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon at Chicks Who Fly. You can reach us at chickswhoflyofficial@gmail.com and on our website, chickswhofly.com. Thank you so much once again, and we look forward to spending some more time with you on the next episode of Chicks Who Fly.